My name is Sarah, and 3 months ago, I was a dedicated marketing coordinator at Henderson & Associates, working 60-hour weeks and believing that loyalty and hard work would eventually pay off. Then my boss, Marcus Henderson, accused me of stealing $50,000 from the company's client trust fund, had me arrested in front of my colleagues, and destroyed my reputation so thoroughly that I couldn't get hired anywhere in the city. What he didn't count on was me discovering the real reason behind his betrayal, or how far I'd go to expose the truth that would bring his entire empire crashing down. If you're watching this story unfold, drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from, and hit that subscribe button, because what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about justice and revenge. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled the career of the man who tried to destroy mine, let me paint you a picture of who I was before this nightmare began. I was the employee every boss claims they want, 28 years old, fresh out of my MBA program, and hungry to prove myself in the corporate world. I arrived at the office by 7 every morning, stayed until 8 most nights, and genuinely believed that if I worked hard enough and remained loyal enough, success would follow naturally. Henderson & Associates was a mid-sized marketing firm specializing in luxury real estate clients, and I thought I'd found my dream job when Marcus Henderson personally hired me 18 months earlier. Marcus was everything I thought a successful executive should be. 45 years old, impeccably dressed, with the kind of confidence that commanded every room he entered. He drove a silver Porsche, wore watches that cost more than my annual rent, and had this way of making you feel like you were part of something important when he spoke to you. During my interview, he leaned back in his leather chair and said something that stuck with me for months. "Sarah, I don't hire people who want jobs. I hire people who want careers. I can see that hunger in your eyes." I practically floated out of that office, convinced I'd found not just an employer, but a mentor who would guide my ascent through the corporate ranks. The first year at Henderson & Associates felt like validation of every career decision I'd ever made. I managed campaigns for high-end properties, coordinated client events that brought in millions in commissions, and earned praise from Marcus that made my colleagues envious. "Sarah gets it," he would say during team meetings, gesturing toward me with that confident smile. "She understands that excellence isn't negotiable." I worked weekends without complaint, took calls during vacations, and gradually took on responsibilities that should have belonged to someone with twice my experience and salary. But there were signs I should have noticed, red flags that seemed like opportunities at the time. Marcus began asking me to handle increasingly sensitive financial tasks, saying he needed someone he could trust completely. I was flattered when he gave me access to client trust accounts, explaining that his previous assistant had made too many errors and he needed someone detail-oriented to manage the transfers. When he asked me to process payments after hours or handle transactions that seemed unusually complex, I told myself this was what career advancement looked like. Trust meant responsibility, and responsibility meant growth. The company culture at Henderson & Associates was built around Marcus's personality, and that personality demanded absolute loyalty. He had a way of making you feel either completely valued or utterly disposable, depending on his mood and your recent performance. Staff meetings often felt like auditions, with each of us competing to deliver the insight or idea that would earn his approval. He rewarded his favorites with expensive dinners, exclusive client meetings, and the kind of public recognition that made others desperate to join the inner circle. I worked harder than ever to stay in his good graces, not realizing I was being systematically isolated from my colleagues and given access to information that would later be used against me. The first crack in my perfect corporate fantasy appeared about 6 months before everything exploded. I was reviewing monthly financial reports when I noticed discrepancies in several client accounts. Payments that should have been transferred to escrow were showing up as internal transfers, and the amounts didn't match the invoices I'd processed. When I brought this to Marcus's attention, he brushed off my concerns with practiced ease. "Sarah, you're looking at preliminary reports," he said, not even glancing up from his computer. The accounting department runs reconciliation at month end. These numbers will balance out. I accepted his explanation because I wanted to believe him, because questioning Marcus meant questioning the entire foundation of my career trajectory. But the discrepancies kept appearing, and they were getting larger. 50,000 here, 30,000 there, amounts that seemed significant even for a company handling multi-million-dollar real estate transactions. I started keeping my own records, not out of suspicion, but out of the compulsive attention to detail that had gotten me hired in the first place. I created spreadsheets tracking every payment I processed, every transfer I authorized, every client interaction that involved money changing hands. I told myself I was being thorough, protecting both the company and myself by maintaining meticulous documentation. 3 months before my world collapsed, Marcus's behavior toward me began to shift in ways so subtle, I almost missed them. The praise became less frequent, the special assignments started going to other team members, and he developed a habit of questioning my work in ways he never had before. "Are you sure about these numbers, Sarah?" he'd ask, looking at reports I'd triple-checked. "I'm seeing some inconsistencies in your recent submissions." At first, I doubled down, working even harder to regain his confidence, staying later at the office and reviewing every detail multiple times before submitting anything to him. The paranoia started small, like a whisper at the edge of my consciousness that I kept trying to silence. Why was Marcus suddenly asking me to handle cash transactions that had always been processed through the normal banking channels? Why were client payments being routed through accounts I'd never seen before? Why did he seem nervous when certain clients called? And why did he always take those calls in private? I began noticing that the financial irregularities I'd identified months earlier weren't random errors. They formed a pattern that pointed toward systematic manipulation of client funds. One evening in late October, while working alone in the office to catch up on a backlog of client reports, I made a discovery that changed everything. I was looking for backup documentation for a payment discrepancy when I found a folder in Marcus's filing cabinet that contained copies of financial records I'd never seen before. The folder was labeled with my name and contained what appeared to be evidence of unauthorized transfers, forged signatures, and financial improprieties spanning the past 8 months. Every questionable transaction I'd been asked to process was documented there, along with emails that appeared to be from my account authorizing activities I'd never approved. My hands shook as I photographed every document in that folder with my phone, understanding with crystal clarity that I was looking at the framework of my own destruction. Marcus hadn't been trusting me with additional responsibilities. He'd been systematically positioning me to take the fall for his embezzlement scheme. Every late-night transaction, every unusual payment request, every time he'd praised my discretion and reliability, he'd been building a case that would paint me as the architect of his crimes. The next morning, I arrived at the office with a stomach full of lead and a phone full of evidence, still hoping there was some explanation that would make sense of what I'd discovered. Marcus greeted me with his usual professional smile, asked about my weekend plans, and complimented me on the client presentation I'd prepared for the following week. For a moment, I almost convinced myself I'd misunderstood what I'd found, that there was some innocent explanation for why my name was on documents authorizing financial activities I'd never heard of. That afternoon, everything I thought I knew about trust, loyalty, and justice was about to be destroyed in the most public and humiliating way possible. That Tuesday started like any other, with me sitting at my desk, reviewing quarterly reports and trying to shake the dread that had been following me since discovering that damning folder. I kept glancing at Marcus through his glass office door, watching him make phone calls and wondering if he knew I'd seen the evidence of what he'd been planning. Every time he looked in my direction, my heart rate spiked. But I forced myself to maintain the same professional demeanor I'd cultivated for 18 months. Around 10 in the morning, Marcus called me into his office with that same confident smile I'd once found so reassuring. Sarah, we need to discuss some irregularities that have come to light in the client trust accounts. My mouth went dry as he gestured for me to sit in the chair across from his desk, the same chair where I'd once felt so proud to receive his praise and recognition. This time, the leather felt cold against my back, and his expression had shifted from mentor to prosecutor. He opened a manila folder, the same folder I'd photographed the night before, and began spreading documents across his desk with theatrical precision. "Can you explain these unauthorized transfers?" he asked, pointing to bank records that showed my digital signature on transactions I'd never approved. "Or these emails from your account directing payments to offshore accounts?" Each piece of evidence was perfectly crafted to implicate me. Every digital fingerprint leading back to my computer, my login credentials, my supposed authorization. I tried to speak, to explain that I'd never seen these documents before, but Marcus held up his hand with the authority of someone who'd orchestrated this entire conversation. "Sarah, I trusted you with access to sensitive financial information, and you violated that trust in the worst possible way." His voice carried just the right mixture of disappointment and moral outrage. The performance of a boss betrayed by an employee he'd believed in. $50,000 has been systematically stolen from client accounts over the past 8 months, and every trail leads directly to you. The walls of his office seemed to close in as he continued his presentation, each accusation delivered with the confidence of someone who'd spent months preparing for this moment. He had copies of email exchanges I'd supposedly initiated, bank records showing transfers I'd allegedly authorized, and even security footage of me accessing the office after hours on dates that coincided with the thefts. Every piece of evidence was circumstantial, but collectively painted a picture of guilt so convincing that even I began questioning my own memory. "I don't understand," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus, you know I would never steal from the company. You've seen my work ethic, my dedication." But even as I spoke, I could see in his eyes that this conversation was never about discovering the truth. It was about establishing his version of events for whatever audience would matter most, whether that was the police, the other employees, or the clients whose money had actually been stolen. Marcus leaned back in his chair, assuming the posture of a disappointed father rather than an accusing boss. "Sarah, I want to believe you, but the evidence is overwhelming. I've already contacted our legal department and the authorities. This is out of my hands now." The casual way he mentioned involving the police made my blood turn to ice. This wasn't just about losing my job or facing internal disciplinary action. He was preparing to destroy my life completely, to ensure that I'd never be able to challenge his narrative or investigate what had really happened to that missing money. 20 minutes later, I was sitting at my desk in a daze, trying to process what had just occurred when 2 police officers walked through the front entrance of Henderson and Associates. The entire office fell silent as they approached Marcus's office, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from normal workplace routine to something far more serious. Through the glass walls, I could see Marcus gesturing in my direction while speaking to the officers, his expression perfectly calibrated to convey reluctant cooperation with law enforcement. Detective Patricia Wells introduced herself with professional courtesy tinged with suspicion, explaining that they needed to ask me some questions about financial irregularities at the company. "Ms. Rodriguez, we understand you've had access to client trust accounts and have been responsible for processing significant financial transactions." Her partner, Detective Mike Chen, positioned himself slightly behind me, close enough that I could feel his presence, but far enough to avoid seeming threatening. The positioning was deliberate, designed to make me feel surrounded and pressured to confess. Every eye in the office was on us as Detective Wells began asking questions about specific transactions, dates, and amounts that corresponded exactly to the evidence Marcus had shown me an hour earlier. My colleagues pretended to work while obviously listening to every word. their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock to judgment as the nature of the accusations became clear. Jennifer from accounting looked particularly stunned, her mouth hanging open as she realized I was being questioned about theft. David from client relations kept glancing between me and Marcus, clearly trying to understand how someone he'd worked beside for over a year could be accused of such serious crimes. "I need to call a lawyer," I said, the words coming out stronger than I felt. Detective Wells nodded approvingly, as if this was exactly what she'd expected a guilty person to say. "That's your right, Ms. Rodriguez, but we'd appreciate your cooperation in clearing this matter up quickly. If you're innocent, helping us understand what happened would be in your best interest." The logical part of my brain knew I should remain silent until I had legal representation, but the desperate part wanted to explain, to convince these officers and my colleagues that I was being framed. Marcus appeared at my desk with perfect timing, his expression conveying just the right mixture of concern and disappointment. "Officers, I want to emphasize that this is incredibly difficult for all of us. Sarah has been a valued member of our team, which makes these allegations even more shocking." He placed his hand on my shoulder in what appeared to be a gesture of support, but felt like a brand marking me as guilty. "We'll cooperate fully with your investigation, of course." The next few hours passed in a blur of questions, accusations, and increasingly hostile stares from my colleagues. Detective Wells seemed convinced of my guilt before she'd even finished reading the evidence Marcus provided, nodding knowingly as each piece of documentation was presented. When she finally placed the handcuffs around my wrists, the metallic click echoed through the silent office like a gavel falling. "Sarah Rodriguez? You're under arrest for embezzlement and fraud," she announced, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the space where I'd spent the last 18 months building what I thought was my career. The perp walk through the office was the most humiliating experience of my life. Every person I'd shared coffee with, collaborated on projects with, and considered a workplace friend watched as I was led past their desks in handcuffs. Some looked shocked, others disappointed, but most just looked away, already distancing themselves from the scandal I represented. Marcus stood by his office door, shaking his head sadly, as if witnessing the downfall of someone he truly cared about, the perfect picture of a boss betrayed by a trusted employee. As the police car pulled away from Henderson and Associates, I caught one last glimpse of the building where I'd invested so much of my identity and ambition. Through the rear window, I could see Marcus standing at his office window, watching my departure with an expression I couldn't quite read from that distance. But something about his posture, the slight straightening of his shoulders, and the way he adjusted his tie, suggested satisfaction rather than sorrow. In that moment, I realized this had never been about catching a thief or protecting the company. This had been about eliminating a threat, and I was just beginning to understand what kind of threat I'd unknowingly become. The holding cell at the downtown precinct was exactly what you'd expect from every crime drama you've ever watched. Except the smell was worse, and the fluorescent lights made everything look sickly and surreal. I sat on the metal bench staring at my hands, still feeling the phantom weight of those handcuffs and trying to process how 18 months of dedication had led to this concrete box. The other women in the cell gave me curious glances, but mostly kept to themselves, each wrapped in their own legal nightmare. My one phone call went to my sister Emma, who worked as a paralegal across town. Her voice went from cheerful greeting to stunned silence as I explained where I was and why I needed her to contact a criminal defense attorney immediately. "Sarah, this has to be some kind of mistake," she kept saying, as if repetition could somehow undo the reality of my situation. "You've never even gotten a speeding ticket." But mistakes don't involve months of fabricated evidence and carefully orchestrated setups, though I couldn't bring myself to explain that to her yet. The attorney Emma found was Margaret Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who specialized in white-collar crime defense. She arrived at the precinct 3 hours after my arrest, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of no-nonsense expression that suggested she'd seen every variation of corporate betrayal imaginable. When she sat across from me in the interview room, her first words weren't reassuring. "Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you. The evidence against you is substantial and appears well documented. We need to understand exactly what happened and how you want to proceed." I spent the next 2 hours walking Margaret through everything I could remember about the past 8 months, every unusual transaction Marcus had asked me to handle, every late-night office session, every time I'd questioned something and been given a reasonable-sounding explanation. She took notes with mechanical precision, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed just how thoroughly I'd been manipulated. "Did you ever question why you were being given access to accounts typically handled by senior management?" she asked. The answer was obvious in hindsight. I'd been too flattered by the apparent trust to recognize I was being set up as a scapegoat. Margaret's assessment was brutally honest. The prosecution had bank records, email trails, security footage, and financial documentation that painted a convincing picture of systematic embezzlement. Even worse, Marcus had positioned himself as the whistleblower who discovered my alleged crimes, making him appear credible and sympathetic. "Juries love stories about hardworking bosses betrayed by trusted employees," she explained. "It confirms their worst fears about workplace loyalty. We need something more than your word against his if we're going to mount an effective defense." But I had something more, and as I told Margaret about the folder I'd discovered and the photographs I'd taken, her expression shifted from resigned professionalism to sharp interest. "You're telling me you have evidence that this setup was premeditated?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. "Documentation with your name on it that predates the time frame when these transactions allegedly occurred?" When I showed her the photos on my phone, her entire demeanor changed. This wasn't just about defending an innocent client anymore. This was about exposing a deliberate frame job. The bail hearing was set for the following morning, and Margaret warned me that spending the night in county lockup was inevitable. The women's facility was a maze of echoing corridors and slamming metal doors, filled with people whose stories I could only guess at. My cellmate was a woman named Tracy who'd been arrested for check fraud and seemed genuinely surprised that someone in business attire had ended up in the same situation. "Honey, you look like you've never seen the inside of a police station before," she observed accurately. "What kind of mess did you step in?" Sleep was impossible on the narrow cot with its thin mattress and rough blanket. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marcus's satisfied expression as I was led away in handcuffs, or replayed moments from the past months when I should have recognized what was happening. The worst part wasn't even the legal jeopardy I was facing. It was the realization that someone I trusted and admired had been systematically destroying my life while I worked harder to earn his approval. The betrayal cut deeper than any potential prison sentence. The bail hearing was a surreal experience where my life was reduced to a series of financial calculations and risk assessments. The prosecutor, a stern man in his 40s named David Walsh, argued that I was a flight risk with access to sophisticated financial networks and the skills to disappear with stolen money. Margaret countered that I was a first-time offender with strong community ties and a clean record who deserved the presumption of innocence. The judge, a woman who looked like she'd heard every sob story imaginable, set bail at $75,000, an amount that might as well have been $7 million given my financial situation. Emma mortgaged her house to post my bail, a sacrifice that added guilt to my growing list of emotions. As we drove away from the courthouse, she kept glancing at me as if expecting me to suddenly confess or break down completely. "Sarah, I need you to tell me honestly, did you take that money?" The question hung in the air between us, and I realized that even my own sister harbored doubts about my innocence. The systematic destruction of my reputation was already working exactly as Marcus had planned. Returning to my apartment felt like entering a crime scene. The police had executed a search warrant while I was in custody. leaving everything slightly displaced and carrying the violation of strangers rifling through my personal belongings. My laptop was gone, along with various financial documents and anything that might contain evidence. But they'd missed the backup drive I kept hidden in a hollowed-out book, the same paranoid habit that had led me to photograph Marcus's incriminating folder. Sometimes the smallest acts of caution become the foundation of survival. The story had already hit the local news by the time I was released. Marketing coordinator arrested for embezzlement appeared in both the morning paper and the evening broadcast, complete with my employee photo from the Henderson and Associates website. The article portrayed Marcus as a successful businessman shocked by his employees' betrayal, while I was described as a recent MBA graduate who'd apparently let ambition override ethics. The narrative was exactly what he'd wanted to establish, painting me as young, greedy, and willing to betray trust for financial gain. My phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, former colleagues, and people I hadn't spoken to in years who'd seen the news coverage. Most of the calls I ignored, but Jennifer from accounting left a voicemail that made my blood run cold. "Sarah, I can't believe what's happening, but I wanted you to know that Marcus called a staff meeting yesterday. He's bringing in a forensic accountant to review all the client accounts and make sure there aren't any other irregularities. He also promoted Amanda to take over your responsibilities." The speed with which I was being replaced suggested this transition had been planned well in advance. Margaret called that evening with updates that ranged from concerning to potentially promising. The prosecution was moving quickly, clearly confident in their case, and eager to secure a conviction that would generate positive publicity. But the forensic analysis of my computer and email accounts was raising questions that Margaret's investigator found interesting. "There are digital fingerprints that don't quite match your typical usage patterns," she explained. "Someone with sophisticated knowledge of computer systems might have had remote access to your accounts." But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Margaret had hired a private investigator named David Kim, a former police detective who specialized in corporate fraud cases. During his preliminary research into Henderson and Associates, he discovered something that made Marcus's squeaky clean reputation far more complicated. "Sarah, your boss isn't just a successful marketing executive," Margaret told me during our meeting at her office. "He's been investigated twice before for financial irregularities at his previous companies. Both cases were dropped when key witnesses suddenly became uncooperative or left town. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was far more sinister than simple embezzlement. Marcus was a serial predator who used his position and charisma to identify vulnerable employees, manipulate them into compromising positions, and then sacrifice them when he needed to cover his tracks. I was just his latest victim, but unlike his previous targets, I had evidence of his methods and the determination to fight back. The war he'd started by destroying my life was about to become very different from what he'd expected." As I sat in Margaret's office, reviewing David Kim's preliminary findings, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my arrest, a sense of purpose that went beyond simply proving my innocence. Marcus had made a crucial mistake by underestimating me, by assuming that a young woman with no criminal experience would simply accept defeat and fade away quietly. He was about to learn that the same attention to detail and systematic approach that had made me valuable as an employee would make me absolutely devastating as an enemy. The real investigation was just beginning, and this time, I would be the one setting the traps. What David Kim discovered in his initial research was just the tip of an iceberg that would ultimately sink Marcus Henderson's carefully constructed empire. Over the next 2 weeks, working 18-hour days from my apartment while fighting off panic attacks and fielding calls from debt collectors, I transformed from desperate defendant into methodical detective. The skills Marcus had praised during my employment, my obsessive attention to detail and ability to spot patterns in complex data, became the weapons I'd use to dismantle his life piece by piece. Margaret introduced me to Sarah Chen, a forensic accountant who specialized in tracking sophisticated financial fraud. Sarah was everything I wished I could be in that moment: calm, analytical, and completely unimpressed by Marcus's reputation or charm. She'd worked on cases involving embezzlement schemes that made my situation look simple, and within hours of reviewing the evidence David had gathered, she identified discrepancies that the police investigators had completely missed. "Your boss is good, but he's not as clever as he thinks," Sarah explained during our first meeting, spreading financial documents across her conference table like a general planning a campaign. "He's been using the same basic methodology for years, just refined enough to avoid detection by standard auditing procedures. The beauty of his system is that it always requires a fall guy, someone with legitimate access who can be blamed when the numbers don't add up." Sorry. But Marcus had made one critical error in his rush to frame me. He'd left traces of the real money trail buried in subsidiary accounts and shell companies that he'd assumed no one would think to investigate. Sarah's forensic software, designed to track money laundering operations, began uncovering transfers and transactions that painted a picture of systematic theft spanning not just months, but years. The $50,000 I'd been accused of stealing was pocket change compared to what Marcus had actually been taking. David Kim's investigation into Marcus's background revealed a pattern that made my stomach turn. His previous companies hadn't just experienced financial irregularities. They'd suffered complete collapses after key employees were accused of embezzlement and either fled or committed suicide rather than face prosecution. Marcus would swoop in as the responsible executive trying to save the company, usually ending up with lucrative consulting contracts or acquisition deals that left him significantly wealthier while his scapegoats disappeared into obscurity or worse. "There was a woman named Lisa Patel at his last company," David explained during one of our evening strategy sessions. "Similar age to you, similar background, similar access to financial systems. She was found dead in her car 3 days before her trial was supposed to start, ruled a suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. The case against her collapsed, and Marcus landed a $2 million consulting deal with the firm that acquired the company's assets." The revelation that I might not be Marcus's first victim to face such extreme consequences added urgency to our investigation. This wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. It was about preventing way he'd tried to destroy me. Every him, from destroying anyone else, the document we uncovered, every financial trail we followed, every witness we interviewed, brought us closer to understanding the full scope of his operations. Margaret filed motion after motion to delay my trial, buying us time to build our case, while the prosecution grew increasingly frustrated with our requests for additional discovery. Assistant District Attorney Walsh seemed confident that the evidence against me was overwhelming, but his confidence began wavering as our defense team raised questions about digital forensics, timeline inconsistencies, and Marcus's convenient role as both victim and primary witness. 6 months later, Marcus Henderson was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy charges totaling over $3 million across multiple companies. His empire crumbled as clients fled, his assets were seized, and his reputation became a cautionary tale whispered in corporate circles. I was completely exonerated, but more importantly, I'd prevented him from destroying anyone else's life the way he'd tried to destroy mine. Sometimes, justice isn't about getting even. It's about making sure the people who prey on trust and loyalty can never do it again. Remember, when someone tries to bury you, they might not realize they're planting seeds for their own destruction.